Good afternoon, everyone. We are delighted to have so many colleagues joining us today at our inaugural keynote for the Reimagining Assessment Practicum with Dr. Robert Talbert, featuring his new book, Grading for Growth: An Alternative Practices Guide to Promote Authentic Learning and Student Engagement in Higher Education. I'm Jennifer Key, Senior Director of the Searle Center for Advancing Learning and Teaching, and on behalf of the Practicum Planning Committees, including Associate Provost Miriam Sharon and Sean Reynolds, VP and CIO, and my co-chair on the Content Committee, Michelle Guitar from NU Libraries. It's my pleasure to welcome you today and to share a few highlights about this exciting university initiative. The Practicum is now in its fourth year, and it's part of a continuous effort to build institutional capacity for evidence-based pedagogy that fosters student belonging and success. It began in 2020 with the Foundations of Online Teaching Practicum, which engaged over 700 instructors who were making the emergency shift to remote instruction. And then building on that momentum and the learning, we then created the Inclusive Teaching and Universal Design for Learning Practicums. It's been an incredibly vibrant and iterative process, and collaboration is really the centerpiece. The content is carefully curated by experts and honed for each iteration. We also engage in rigorous assessment and evaluation. So after today's keynote, you'll receive a link to a very brief, just 3-minute survey, and your feedback is really invaluable to this process. In choosing new topics, we consider the contemporary context, and the pinch point that kept coming up for instructors was grading and assessment. Instructors were really curious about strategies that enable students to maximize learning and growth, and ways to make grading a more meaningful interaction with our students. So the Reimagining Assessment Practicum will be a 3-week online experience designed for participants to learn more about and reflect on their assessment and grading practices. And the emphasis is on equitable approaches and alternative methods. So it's offered each quarter, open to Northwestern University instructors at all levels, backgrounds, and teaching contexts. Includes interactive synchronous sessions, asynchronous learning activities, individual consultations, as well as optional learning labs. Here's a QR code and a bit.ly link if you'd like to register or learn more about the Practicum. And as you can see from this list, the Practicum infrastructure is built by the commitment of units across the student learning ecosystem, working together to advance the strategic imperative of ensuring that all students can thrive during their time at Northwestern. So joining us today to celebrate the past successes and the launch of the Reimagining Assessment Practicum is Dr. Robert Talbert, who received his PhD in mathematics from Vanderbilt University. He is currently a professor in the mathematics department at Grand Valley State University. His book, recently published with Routledge and co-written with his colleague David Karp, responds to our collective wonderment about whether they could be a fundamentally different approach, something beyond traditional high-stakes testing that we all experienced ourselves as students, alternative assessment and grading strategies that might move students towards deeper learning and liberate us from the emotional toll of grade disputes and hours of providing extensive feedback that we don't always see students incorporating in their future work. So Robert will share some of his own journey, how he began experimenting with specs grading, and how this transformed his teaching and his relationships with his students. We really appreciate the richness in his book of the case studies across a broad range of disciplines, demonstrating new approaches. Based on the questions that participants submitted in advance, that is what we are all open to exploring, new possibilities. The Q&A feature in today's session will allow for anonymous posts and questions, as well as an upvote button so that we can indicate what is most resonant with the audience, and we'll choose those for our half-hour Ask Me Anything session. So I'll rejoin Robert at the conclusion of his presentation, and I would like to turn things over to you, Robert. Welcome.
All right, thanks so much, Jen, and thank you all for being here in the audience. It's really a great pleasure to be with you. The only thing that would make this better today is if I could actually be with you at Northwestern. I love the city of Chicago. It's one of my family's favorite places to go. In particular, it's my 17-year-old daughter's happy place, and she is bound and determined to go to college in Chicago at some place or another. Maybe it'll be Northwestern, who knows? I want to specifically thank all the organizing team for putting this together. Have done such an outstanding job, not only with just helping me get ready to do this talk right now, but also the entire Reimagining Assessment Practicum. This sounds like a fantastic resource, and how fortunate you all are at Northwestern to have such a great team and great resources to tap into. Before I get started, let me just reintroduce myself. Again, my name's Robert Talbert, and I'm a professor in the mathematics department at Grand Valley State University. We're just across the lake from y'all in near the Grand Rapids, Michigan area in Allendale, right here, if you know the trick about the hand in Michigan. We're a 23,000 student public university in the Grand Rapids area. We have campuses in Allendale, Michigan, and in Grand Rapids downtown. And today I want to speak with you from my experiences at Grand Valley. I've been there for 12 years and I spent 14 years at small liberal arts colleges prior to being at Grand Valley. And I want to share with you today and maybe get some discussion, hopefully going with you about one of the most urgent and pivotal issues in higher education today, and that would be grades and grading. Before I do that, though, before I launch we'll launch my slides now, I think. I want to share some things with you. First screens. There's that. Over in the, first of all, on your screens here, and I'm going to put this in the chat just momentarily, you see a QR code and a link. That link goes to a resource page that I've set up for you. I'm just about to drop all of these links, several more there in the chat. There you go. This resource page that I've set up for you is a Google document that has links to this talk. It has links to David's and my book, and a whole lot more, including course materials, research papers for you to read more about, just anything and everything that I could think of. And everything that I cite today in this talk is linked in the resource page. So please bookmark that, make a copy of it, keep it for yourself. This is for you just to kind of refer back to during the talk and after the talk. Secondly, there in the chat is a link to this presentation. You can see there, you can get to the slides and follow along now or later if you want. Third, the third link there, much of what I'll be speaking about today comes from my new book, mine and David Clark's new book called Grading for Growth, again, co-authored with my great Grand Valley Math Department colleague, David Clark. This book just came out a couple of months ago, and again, I'll be referencing it quite a bit, and I hope that each and every one of you purchases a copy for yourself and for your loved ones for Christmas. To help make that dream a reality, on the resource page, and there in the chat is there's a link to the Routledge catalog, and I'm pleased on the resource page to give you a code that'll give you 20% off that book if you purchase it from Routledge's website. You'll find that code somewhere in the top third of the first page. And then fourth, David and I publish a blog also called Grading for Growth. We don't get too creative with our titling schemes here. Everything is called Grading for Growth. And our blog has new content every Monday about grades, grading, assessment. Sometimes it's big ideas, sometimes it's philosophical, sometimes it's very practical. Our blog is a free Substack publication. You can subscribe to it by going to gradingforgrowth.com. There you see the link in the chat. And you can get these new posts delivered to your inbox every Monday. We're currently featuring monthly guest posts from faculty from all over North America right now. And we're booked out through August of next year with guest posters from all walks of life in academia. And we are learning a lot from our guest posters. And we'd be really honored to have you among our subscribers. So with all that, I on to the main idea. Again, there is the QR code and the link for the resource page. That'll remain in the chat if you anytime you want to scroll up and get back to it. So now on to the main idea about grades and grading. I'm hesitant to do this because grading is one of those facts about academic life that people tend to want to think about as little as possible, right? Including students, despite all appearances. Students talk a lot about grades. In fact, it seems to be the only thing they can think about. But maybe you get a little bit of ambivalence sometimes. Maybe you see this show up like when you have students who seem to underperform in a math class, but suddenly when it comes to determining the statistics of trying to figure out what grade they have to have on the next exam to get a B in the class, they shoot up to PhD level analytical skills. Students seem to love those grades, but yet if you ask a student one-on-one off the record, if you could eliminate all grades from your life right now, would you? Most of the time, in my experiences, once the student has sort of processed what you're asking them to do, you will almost always get a desperately enthusiastic yes. So there's something about grades and the way we do grades and grading in higher education that is just deeply dysfunctional. We can't live them and we can't seem to live without them. In fact, I'd say that if you look at any area of dysfunction in higher education today, and let's face it, that means looking at any area of higher education today, because it seems to be dysfunctional all over the place. Student enrollment drop-offs, the so-called enrollment cliff, student engagement, the stifling of innovation and teaching, even the tenuousness of contingent faculty labor. Anywhere you find dysfunction in higher ed, you will find grades and grading either at the center of it or right next to it, adjacent to it. Grades and grading are a factory of dysfunction lurking at the very center of this entire enterprise, hidden in plain sight. And to just kind of share my own story about this, let me share with you how all this became suddenly very real to me a few years ago and set me off on the path that eventually has led me to you today. So 10 years ago, fall of 2013, in fact, I was teaching calculus at Grand Valley. This is a subject I have taught hundreds of times going back to my grad school days at Vanderbilt. I felt like I was pretty innovative. I was using a flipped learning model, so that's cool, and a lot of active learning, a lot of technology. But my grading system was kind of standard. It was quizzes, tests, labs, and homework. It was all graded with points. These points accumulated over time, and then they were transmuted somehow into a percentage, which then got turned back into a letter that I fed to the registrar's office. But all things considered, I figured I was doing a pretty hip and humane job of running my class, and it represented my best efforts at creating a student-focused learning environment at that time. So again, I was teaching this course. I was using a basic structure when something terrible happened. What happened was I had a student that was bright and enthusiastic about learning calculus. That's not the terrible part. This student can learn better than most students I have ever known, but only if she had about 5 to 10 days longer than anybody else to do it. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. She would grasp the most difficult concepts deeply, but not until we had been done with it for about a week to 2 weeks. In other words, she took her time getting up to speed with a subject, but then she would just rapidly accelerate to master that subject. I saw it in her classwork. I saw it in how she worked with groups. But this became a huge issue with a fundamental component of the class, which was time testing, timed one and done testing. This testing happened on my schedule and not hers, and that was an issue. She took her first test right about this time of the semester, and it resulted in a grade that was so low that it mathematically eliminated her from an A in the class in one stroke. The second test, after that, same story. She was eliminated from getting a B in the class. After the third test, which had a similar result, she vanished from the class entirely, and I never saw her again. And I should say, leading up to that time, her disposition in class just got worse and worse and worse. And at one point, we were working in groups, and she just stopped and just shouted out, "I don't see why we should be working on this at all. I'm never going to get it." And she turned from this really bright, enthusiastic student to just someone with real issues, with real problems that were messing up her life. She ended up with an F in the course. And I had a front row seat to the whole thing, watching my grading system just crush her slowly but surely. And I remember sitting in my office in Mackinac Hall at Grand Valley State, typing in that F into the course LMS at the final buzzer of the semester. And I swore to myself that this would never happen again on my watch, and that I don't know what it was going to take, but I was going to completely throw out the way that I had done grading for 14 years, 15 years up to that point, and replace it with something else, even if I had to invent it myself. So something is deeply broken with the way that we grade. It's central or adjacent grading, that is central or adjacent to just about everything we can think that's going wrong with higher education today. And it's not our fault, and it's not our students' fault. There's just no point trying to lay blame on the right people, which so much of higher education media seems to want to do. So what is it? What is it that's the matter with grading? Is it fixable? What are we supposed to do about it to help our students grow and become functioning, learning human beings for the rest of their lives? So here's the main message for today. Traditional grading is broken. It might not be fixable, but it is replaceable. And now's the time to start thinking about how to do it. Traditional grading is broken. It might not be fixable, but it is replaceable. And now's the time to start thinking about how to do it. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to try to unpack every part of this message. So our roadmap for today is, first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about what I mean by traditional grading and give a sense of where it came from. Then I'm going to lay out 3 particular issues with traditional grading that show just how broken it really is and why continuing on with it in any form may not be an option. And then I'll describe a framework for replacing traditional grades with alternatives that serve students well and avoid all these issues that plague traditional methods. And then I have some questions from you that you submitted beforehand. Some of you submitted beforehand. I want to address that actually are different from the AMA session later on. A lot of great questions. And then I'll have some open time for questions. And of course, we have a extended AMA Q&A session afterwards. So again, while the talk is ongoing, I just want to echo what Jen said earlier. If you have a particular question, I encourage you to stick it in either the chat or the Q&A feature on Zoom. The Q&A feature in particular lets you see and upvote questions that have already been asked, and this will help prioritize the questions that I get to later. Okay, so first of all, I've used this term traditional grading a few times. So what do I mean by this? Well, I mean pretty much what we've experienced ourselves. These are any system of evaluating student work where individual assignments are given some kind of numerical score, usually a numerical score. And those assignments are typically, but not always, one and done, meaning you do the assignment and then you get a grade and there's no retakes. Then those grades, those individual scores are put through some kind of a statistical formula to arrive at a summative number statistic for the course. It's usually in the form of a percentage or a number between 0 and 100. And then the output of that gets mapped onto a letter A, B, C, D, or F, possibly with a plus minus modifier, which then gets fed to the registrar's office, which goes to the transcript. Now, there's very basic variations on this theme, and not every college class is actually graded this way. Some are graded pass, fail, and so on. But this, by and large, is the system we typically use, and it's probably what we ourselves experienced as students and what our professors before us experienced when they were students, and so on and so on and so on back through time. Back through time, though, you might wonder how far back does this system actually go? I mean, traditional grading is like any other tradition. It didn't just happen. It's the conscious choice or an accumulation of conscious choices of a person or group trying to solve a problem. So it's instructive to briefly look at the history of grades, which is a much more interesting subject than it sounds like. But trivia question for you first. Think about this question and type your answer in the chat, but wait for my signal to do it. We'll do it waterfall style. So traditional A, B, C, D, F letter grade system. In what year did that make its debut? Okay, now type it in the chat and let's see what you think. I'm seeing 1950, 1920, 1800, 1880, 1940s, 1940, 1970. It's pretty interesting. It feels like we're getting either like really, really recent or much further in the past than any of those. So it's kind of an interesting idea. The answer, in case you're wondering, is kind of the average of everything you just said. It's 1896, which is just 127 years ago. I say just 127 years ago. That sounds like a long time ago, but when you think that the first university happened in like almost 1,000 years ago, we're talking about roughly 7% of the total history of the university had the grading system that we had now. Prior to 1800, There really wasn't any such thing as a grade or anything like it in higher education. University students would simply take a single oral exam at the end of their studies, and they would get kind of a thumbs up, thumbs down, pass fail evaluation by a committee of experts. If that sounds familiar, yeah, that's where we still have that vestiges of that system in our doctoral thesis defense process. That was the way it always was. Like all degrees were conferred in this kind of way. It wasn't really until 1785 that we have the first recorded use of anything like a grade. It was at Yale University, and it wasn't a number-based system. It was three adjectives. Students were given one of three adjectives to describe their performance. Those adjectives were optimi, inferiores boni, and pejores, which means best, not the best, but still okay, and worse. I feel like we can almost just give emojis if that's the case, like happy face emoji, meh face emoji, and poop emoji for all those three different kinds of grades. There's still no numbers, there's no letters, there's no GPA. In the 19th century, there were all these various experiments with grade structures that ranged everywhere from looks kind of familiar to truly bizarre. Yale, for example, had a brief flirtation with a point scale. Nobody knows what the top end of the scale was, but 225 was considered passing, like just a completely made up number, right? And finally, in 1896, we have the first appearance of what we now recognize as a traditional grading system. Mount Holyoke College, all these New England schools introduced a system where student work was graded using percentages. Those percentages were translated into the letter grades. The letter grades A, B, C, D, and E. Have you ever wondered what happened to the E in a grading scale? Like, why do we have A, B, C, D, F? Well, if you think about it, it's probably what you expect. The students all thought that E was supposed to stand for excellent, and it got really confusing, which that doesn't make any sense to me because A, B, C, and D don't stand for anything. Why should E stand for something? Anyway, it is what it is, and they switched at Mount Holyoke the E to F in 1898, and here we are today. Pretty much, we have not had that system change one bit since 1896. One thing that has changed is the word grade. That was not used in 1896. That didn't come along until the 20th century when we experienced the Industrial Revolution and a cultural obsession in the 1910s and 1920s with measuring and optimizing every process known to man. This is where we got things like the IQ test, for example, and the term grade was appropriated from agriculture. Think of grade A beef or high grade flour. And without much evolution, that gets us to where we are now. So that sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? What can you take away from this little lesson here? Well, I want you to take away a few things from this. Again, this is well worth a deeper study, and we go into it in our book quite a bit. That traditional grading is an invention of administrators and faculty meetings. This is where it all came from, and we all know how well these go sometimes. Okay, I'm on faculty senate at Grand Valley. I'm in the midst of it. We all know that the craziest ideas come from these two sources. And by the way, most of these people making these inventions at that time were white men of privilege. Okay, in a certain niche. Making decisions that were designed to solve administrative record-keeping problems. They're not designed to solve learning problems or growth problems. Traditional grading is also steeped in the Industrial Revolution and the ideas of Taylorism and relentless quantification of everything. Traditional grading is not inherently part of higher education. It's a relatively recent invention. If you hear somebody say that traditional grading is a time-tested process or it has stood the test of time, take another look at the actual timeline and let's think again about that. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, traditional grading, as we know it, is not some kind of time-tested, research-backed best practice that evolved out of decades of careful study and improvement. It is the result of wild guesses, weird experiments, one of which, the one we happen to have today, happened to stick for reasons that nobody is really sure of. So you could really stop right there and be convinced maybe that it's time to move on from traditional grading, but it actually gets considerably worse because even if traditional grading had been the result of decades of mindful, student-focused, research-backed evolution and practice, like you're trying to learn about in the Reimagining assessment practicum, it still would have three serious issues that make it fundamentally and possibly unfixably broken. Before we look at those, I want to just center ourselves on how significant learning actually really works. If you look at research on learning or just look to your own experiences, you will realize that all significant learning happens through engagement with a feedback loop like this. When we want to learn something, we do something, we try something, we get feedback from a trusted source. And that information we take and we try to figure out what it means, and then we incorporate it into another iteration around this loop. And this loop keeps cycling through until we have learned it, quote unquote, well enough, according to whatever standard is appropriate at the time. Sure, we can learn some things without feedback loops. For example, my birthday is July 10th. You just learned this and you did not require any feedback to learn it. But to learn something really significant to you, like think about your favorite hobby, like something you do that you enjoy doing more than anything. If you see my face right now, you see bass guitars hanging from the back of my wall, and that's a fundamental part of my identity. That required a lot of feedback loop. It cannot just be received knowledge. The knowledge that you do receive has to be run through this feedback loop until you can turn it into something meaningful. Feedback loops are not only the only way people learn anything significant, they're also fun. Fun is okay, right? I mean, working through and with feedback and seeing yourself get better at doing something hard is immensely pleasurable, and it's satisfying to human beings. In fact, if you think about games, all games are predicated on feedback. I play Wordle, for example, that game on your phone where you guess the word every morning, and it's based on feedback. And you know what would make that game really dull and boring and uninteresting? You want to know how to take any challenging and engaging task and deliberately redesign it to minimize the amount of fun people get out of it? Take the feedback loop away. When you disconnect the feedback loop from a process, you're not going to learn anything, and it's not fun. So I want you to keep this idea of the feedback loop in mind. It is a centerpiece of how grading could actually work. But let's talk about the three big issues with traditional grading first of all. The first big issue with traditional grading is that traditional grades lack construct validity. Construct validity is just simply the idea that the measure measures what you think it measures. Lacking construct validity means that grades just simply don't measure what we think they do. I think we often think that grades measure learning, or maybe we don't have an idea of what they measure, and that's possibly even worse. But to illustrate this point, think about two students, we'll call them Alice and Bob. They're in a traditionally graded class, and the course grade in the class, A, B, C, D, F, comes from three 100-point exams, and those exam scores are averaged together, and we assign the grade based on the average. So Alice, as you can see here in the grade book, got a 0 on the first exam, and an 80 on the second, and a 100 on the third. Bob is consistently mediocre and got 60 on each. So what are Alice and Bob's grades in the class? And you can do the math here. 180 divided by 3 is a 60. So both Alice and Bob receive a 60%, which is barely passing, if at all. Depends on how your institution measures a D versus an F, but it's not good, whatever it is. But what does the 60% tell us about Alice and Bob? It doesn't really distinguish between their stories, right? What is that 60% anyway? Is it a measure of how much material they've mastered? Does it mean that they know 60% of the material really well and the other 40% not really well? Or do they understand 100% of the material at a quote unquote 60% level? Do Alice and Bob have the same overall level of knowledge or mastery in the subject? Or for that matter, why did Alice get a 0% on the first exam? Is it because she truly didn't understand any of the material? Or maybe was it because she was sick or had to miss class to take care of a family member or work at a job? We really don't know. With a traditional grade, we really cannot tell what any of these numbers mean in any real sense. They lack construct validity. And that's pretty bad, but it actually gets worse than that because numerical grades themselves although usually numbers are not numerical data, and so all the statistics we usually do on them don't have any meaning at all. So just because something is a number does not mean it is what we call numerical data in the statistical sense, okay? Something that might be a measurement, for example. Like take zip codes, for example. A zip code's a number, but is it numerical data? Well, let's think about this. Here you see in front of you a map of the state of Michigan. The Michigan.gov website has a spreadsheet on it that has all the zip codes currently in use in Michigan. So you can take that spreadsheet and run an average on it. And if you average all the zip codes in Michigan, you get that number you see there, 48982.7354. Okay, let's round it up to 48983. That looks nice. And it was computed correctly. The problem is there's nothing there. There is no location or office or anything in the state of Michigan that has that zip code. The average doesn't tell you, for example, the center of population. That would be in that town right there, or 48857 Morris, I think it is in Michigan. It doesn't tell you the center of government, which is Lansing, 48933, although that's awfully close to the average zip code, but it's not equal to it. So this average of zip codes is computable. It's an average like anything else, but it doesn't mean anything because it doesn't tell you any information about locations in Michigan. The reason is because zip codes, while numbers, are not numerical data. They're just labels that happen to be numbers. Okay, that's what a zip code is. It's simply a shorthand for a location. We could have used words or colors or any other kind of label. We call those kinds of data categorical data in statistics because all they do is categorize. They're just labels. They don't measure anything. And no statistics performed on them will change the fact that they are merely labels. And doing statistics that are supposed to be used on numerical data, when you do not feed numerical data into the formulas, do not give you sensible answers. And if I could just pop back up a second to Alice and Bob's picture here, you see those numbers there? They don't measure anything. Okay, this, excuse me, they're numbers, but they're not measurements in any reasonable sense. Alice's 80% on test 2, that wasn't the result of being hooked up to some sort of rigorously calibrated scientific instrument like an EEG that measures learning on a scale of 100. All it is really, it's a label. It's a zip code. It's a zip code. It's a value that represents the professor's best professional judgment of her work on that exam, or perhaps it's the professor's best professional judgment of individual exam problems, and you add them up. Doing statistics meant for numerical data on data that aren't numerical is simply wrong. Now, I want to say there is nothing wrong with faculty giving their best professional judgment on student work and communicating it through a label. In fact, the role of the faculty member, us, in providing that professional perspective is critical. It is central to the higher education experience as it functionally works. What is wrong, and I think what's misleading and maybe even unethical, is to pretend that these numerical point values that result from these evaluations, these judgment calls, are scientific measurements on an objective scale and are therefore valid candidates for statistical processes. They're not. Okay, we think that numerical grades are objective, but it's just objectivity theater, and we need to admit this. So finally, a major problem that we have with traditional grading is motivation. Grades are what we call extrinsic motivators. Extrinsic motivation refers to being motivated not because of the thing itself, but because of some reward we get for doing it. And research tells us that extrinsic rewards are the chief source, for example, of academic dishonesty in higher education today. This paper here by Anderman and others, which is linked on your resource page, by the way, you can go download it yourself, looked at several studies on academic motivation and cheating, and they found that students are more likely to cheat if they hold extrinsic goals or perceive that extrinsic rewards, like grades, are the main point of the class. To remedy this, they strongly recommend that we accept or adopt policies to promote mastery rather than performance and to provide scaffolding to those students as they do it. This is very much unlike how traditionally graded courses are set up, of course. We have one and done assessment and all these point-based grades as the norm. And the only thing that students can seem to talk about is grades, grades, grades. And yet we wonder why cheating is such an issue, and particularly today, especially as generative AI becomes easy to access. I know AI is one of the main topics that y'all are thinking about in this practicum here. We can blame AI or worry about it for a resurgence in academic dishonesty, but quite simply, the easiest way to mitigate academic dishonesty is to stop putting points on things and dethrone grades from the center of our classes. AI is not the issue here. So traditional grading is broken. In my practice and my research throughout all my career, I have neither found nor have I been able to come up with myself any variation on traditional grading that is still traditional grading, but avoids all these problems of construct validity, statistical problems, and motivation. At this point, and I don't mean to be cynical, and I could always be wrong, I don't really believe you can fix traditional grading. I think what you can do, and I think what we must do at this point, is replace it with something different, repeal and replace. And now I'd like to think with you for a few minutes about what some replacements might look like. I also have to warn you that if you were hoping for a deep dive into any one particular model of alternative grading, like, for example, you may have heard of ungrading or specifications grading, you might be a little disappointed here because I'm actually not going to get into the weeds of any particular model today. Maybe you've heard of these particular models. They certainly get a lot of airplay, especially ungrading is talked about a lot. And when we were writing our book, David and I interviewed dozens of university faculty who are using non-traditional approaches to grading already, and just pick their brains about what are they doing and what do their syllabi look like and what kinds of issues are they running into and all that. And we have 17 of those case studies as the heart of our book, and even more that didn't make it into the book because of length. And what we found was that nobody does one thing, and nobody uses only one model. What people do, like real life professors do, is they pick and they choose elements of different models and stitch them together in a particular way that fits them and their students and their courses. Some of them borrow from ungrading and a little bit from specs grading, a little bit from contract grading, and sometimes people just make things up and it's something brand new. Some people borrow from models without even knowing that the model had a name. Like they were doing standards-based grading, but had never even heard of the word standards-based grading, it turned out. These individual models that you see here, and there are dozens more possible, they're models, they're options, not religions. You don't have to declare yourself to be an adherent of ungrading and then do only ungrading. You, as a professor, as a faculty member, have permission to borrow, remix, recombine from many different approaches, and you probably should, honestly. Because one model is usually not big enough of a size to fit everything that you need in your class. And this is how real life people use alternative grading on a day-to-day basis. And because of that, because this is how it plays out in real life, David and I asked as a fundamental question as we were putting our book together, what do all alternative grading practices that are working have in common? Like if you see an alternative grading practice that a professor is doing, and it seems to really be helping students grow, look at them all. What common elements do they have? We asked that question and did quite a bit of work on this and came up with a framework that we call the 4 pillars of alternative grading. In this model, the 4 pillars model, all alternative grading systems that you might choose to use that seem to work well with students have 4 things in common, 4 characteristics. They have clearly defined content standards. They use helpful feedback. They give marks that indicate progress, and they allow reattempts without penalty. Clearly defined standards, helpful feedback, marks that indicate progress, and reattempts without penalty. That little vertical line between the 3rd and 4th pillars is just a graphical artifact, by the way. That doesn't mean anything. And all of these 4 pillars hold up this roof of the feedback loop. All of these are in service to engagement with a feedback loop. Okay, remember that's the center and the source and what the model for all significant learning experiences. So let me unpack each of those 4 pillars just briefly. By clearly defined standards, what I mean is the grading system should make it clear exactly what students are going to need to do to demonstrate their learning. We can only assess what we can observe. That doesn't mean what we can measure. Some things are observable but not quantifiable. But we can only assess what we can observe. So we ask ourselves, what actions will students do to produce observable evidence that they are learning what we want them to learn? And we're going to make that clear both for ourselves and for our students, because they can't hit a target that they can't see. By helpful feedback, that just means remember that all significant learning happens through engagement with a feedback loop. And in fact, the loop drives not only the learning, but the engagement itself. Remember, feedback loops are fun. People like to do feedback loops in general. And that loop really begins with the feedback that students get from us. So we want to give feedback that is truly helpful. It's easy to give feedback. Okay, we give feedback all the time, but how often is it really helpful? Really helpful feedback means that we give students feedback that shows not only what they might have done wrong and where, but also why it was substandard. Helpful feedback also is informative, and it doesn't humiliate the student. Instead, it invites collaboration to solve a problem. And this is true of any feedback you have ever gotten that is helpful. Think about tenure procedures or submitting a journal article to the journal. Reviewer two, bleeds red all over your paper and calls you an idiot. And that's not really helpful, right? It doesn't help you write a better paper. What's helpful is when someone kindly points out the issues and invites you and gives you ideas for improving upon it. That's helpful feedback. By marks that indicate progress, first of all, let me explain the word mark. The word mark is a Canadian sort of non-American way of saying grade. The word grade is kind of ambiguous. It can mean something we give to an individual assignment. It can mean a course grade. It could even mean like a level of schooling, like fifth grade. So we tend to use the word mark to refer to whatever label it is we put on students' work once it's evaluated. Mark in traditional grading is a number, but it doesn't have to be. If you give marks at all in an alternative grading system, and it's possible not to put marks on things, that's what ungrading is about. Work doesn't get marks, it gets only feedback. Anyway, if you give marks at all, they should be clear guideposts of a student's growth. These might be numbers. For example, if I have 10 levels of mastery in a class and a student has reached level 6, I could give that student a mark of 6. And it doesn't mean 60% of the items were done correctly. It just means you're at level 6 and you have 4 levels to go. Or a mark might just be adjectives like Yale used to use. The mark that you give on a paper leans into, rather than away from, its categorical nature as data. And it describes what the student can do and what else they could work on. And then finally, by reattempts without penalty, this is often controversial, but let me explain. In order to close the feedback loops that students are hopefully engaged in, they got to be allowed to revise or reattempt assessments that don't meet our quality standards, whatever those are and however they're defined. Now, a reattempt could be a number of things. It could be a second or third draft of an initial submission, like our friends in the humanities have been doing, like for ages. They're way ahead of the STEM people. Or it might be a new version of a task that has the same overall objective, but it's got different specifics this time around. Whatever it is, students should be allowed to reattempt work that is not quote unquote good enough with helpful feedback until it is quote unquote good enough without being penalized for it. This means, for example, I used to, back in my traditional grading days, have traditionally graded exams, and I would allow students to redo a test out of 100 points, and I would regrade the test using the same rubric, and that's awesome, but then I would refund them half the points. So if they got an 80 the first time around and a 90 the second time around, I give them 5 points back. That's sort of a penalty. It's not full credit for the reattempt. So reattempts without any penalty at all. Because feedback loops involve being wrong a lot. If you're a musician, you know this. If you are learning a sport, you know this. You have to really be bad at some stuff pretty horribly until you are good. And we don't want to penalize people for past badness just because they are going through a perfectly human process. So those are the 4 pillars of any functioning alternative grading system. Clearly defined standards, helpful feedback, marks that indicate progress, and reattempts without penalty. Now, what does this look like concretely? So I'm definitely eating my own dog food here, as it were, because I practice. I mean, I'm just an everyday, in the trenches classroom faculty. I teach 3 classes or teach 2 classes a semester or have some release time to work in the president's office. Ordinarily, I'd be teaching 3 classes a semester, and I have research. I'm just an ordinary faculty member, nothing special. And I practice these principles every day in my own teaching, and I try to. So right now I'm teaching a class called Discrete Structures for Computer Science. I'm going to copy that link here and throw it over in the chat so you can have it for yourself here. There it is. This is a class that I love. It's my favorite class to teach. I teach it this semester. I'll be teaching it next semester. If you follow this link or go to the QR code, you'll be taken to the syllabus for this course. And on the resource page, there's links to other course materials from this class, including sample assessments and so on. I'm not going to give a full rundown of the course design here, but although I would love to talk with you about that later, maybe one-on-one. But I do want to show you some places where these 4 pillars are instantiated in my course. I'm not going to claim these are unimprovable, because definitely there are always issues that I uncover every time I roll out a course. But here's what the pillars look like, for better or for worse, in real life right now for me. So first of all, this course is about the mathematical foundations of computer science, and it's taken by most students in their first and second year. So it is a combination of a lot of basic skills along with applications of those basic skills. I have the grading system set up to assess students along those 2 axes. They have to demonstrate mastery not only of the basic ideas and concepts, but also that they have learned how to apply those basic concepts to interesting problems. Now, on the basic skills side, I've set up 15 what I call learning targets that spell these out. Here you can see the first 4, the other 11 are in the Appendix A of the syllabus. You can go right there by clicking that link. They are phrased in very simple, action-oriented, first-person tasks that explain exactly what students should be able to do. And you can see how these are phrased. The ones that are labeled core, number 2 and 3, these are considered essential topics. There are 8 of those throughout the course. The other 7 are kind of like nice to haves. It would be cool if you could learn this, but you really have to learn the 8 core ones, or you'll see what happens if they don't. So the standards are clearly stated, and I go so far as to actually write these standards out on the quizzes where I assess them. These are assessed on a weekly basis through quizzing, through in-class quizzes, and each quiz problem's focused on one learning target only. And here on the bottom of the slide, you can see a sample quiz problem for learning target number 3. And right below where it says learning target number 3, I am writing literally learning target number 3, just to remind students this is what you are trying to demonstrate. The goal here is to demonstrate skill on your ability to do the following things to a conditional statement. And then, no surprise, the quiz problem itself is to do the things it says to the conditional statement. So the idea here is to have no guesswork and no surprises on quizzes. Clear standards, clear targets to maximize the student's chances of hitting it. And if they don't hit it, it's not because they misunderstood the target. That's important. It's because of a legitimate issue with their skill on the concept. Okay, so we get a clear signal and not a lot of noise. We also have a series of problem sets, I should say, in the course. They're called application extension problems, or AEPs for short, where students apply those learning targets to interesting problems. These are not simple. They're actually pretty difficult, extended, like mini projects. They don't have easily quantified outcomes like the learning targets do. They involve a lot of writing and explanation. Here's a recent sample of a student response to one of these that was just turned in last week. We have this document in the course called Standards for Student Work. You can find that linked on the resource page, that spells out in precise terms what a successful solution to one of these problems looks like. Do the following things, generally speaking, and you should be okay. So just to have clearly defined standards, again, with this kind of assignment. The student's work was okay, but it didn't really address the core issue. The student was tasked with explaining why a process of decrypting an encrypted message that used this particular method should always work. I didn't feel like they really did this, and nothing they said here was wrong, but this didn't really kind of address the issue. So anyway, these are submitted. Students submit their work on our course LMS on Blackboard Ultra, and this is the feedback that I gave. So it's nothing out of the ordinary. It's nothing like extraordinarily, life-changing or anything, but I'm just simply trying to be helpful, okay? Just really get in my brain that I want the student to succeed at this task. I'm not trying to play gotcha with students by catching them not succeeding. Okay, I want them to really be good at this stuff. So I'm going to tell them, like, okay, here's what you did well. Most of it is good. The last item, number 5, wasn't specific enough. Try some examples. Here's what your general explanation should look like. I also include this mainly to show you that helpful feedback doesn't have to be lots of feedback. Okay, you might be wondering, how am I going to fit this into my schedule? Just keep it short, keep it brief, keep it clear. Clear is short, and short is kind, I think. A couple of sentences is usually enough. Okay, thirdly, about marks. Nothing in the class uses points at all. Students' work gets a label that explains the outcome of their work and suggests what they should do next. On pre-class activities, because it is a flipped class, the students are marked success or incomplete. Success means you turned it in on time, there's nothing left blank, and you got at least half the items right. That's success. Incomplete means failure of success. Okay. The checkpoint quiz problems are either graded successful or not. And level 1 means you have demonstrated skill successfully on a learning target once. Level 2 means you've done it twice. So it's literally just tells you how many times you've demonstrated skill. Usually, to master a skill, I want students to demonstrate learning twice in 2 separate instances, just to help me triangulate my data. And then the problem sets are success, retry, or incomplete. If you're successful, you're done. Otherwise, it's a verb. You need to retry this thing. And here's what it looks like in the LMS. So you can rig up most modern LMSs to, they have to accept numerical input, but you can program them to produce text output. I can go into the weeds on that if you like. This is Blackboard Ultra using what's called a schema. Okay, so that's marks that indicate progress. And then finally, I should say the marks that indicate progress and these clear standards all come together in this document called Standards for Student Work. I mentioned that before, and this is what this is the section of the Standards for Student Work that explains exactly what success means, what a retry means, and what an incomplete means. Okay, so we're trying to be very clear, and if students are going to mess something up, it's going to be because of a legitimate failure to understand a concept, not because of the system. So what happens if a student doesn't meet the content standards, you might ask? Well, quite simply, they get to retry it. That's why the label says retry. Except for pre-class work, every item in the class can be retried if it doesn't meet our content standards. For problem sets, AEPs, that just means submitting a new draft and with the items in the feedback addressed. For learning targets, they're marked either successful or unsuccessful. The basic skills, okay, those are assessed on weekly quizzes, and those quizzes are cumulative. So each one contains not only a few new targets, but also all the targets that were previously quizzed upon. So if you try a learning target problem and it doesn't work out, you just practice it and then try again next week. And here's a schedule of how these accumulate over time, a full schedule for the entire semester with some extras that are built in at the end for just those who need to do attempts on earlier stuff. The core learning targets stay on the quizzes all semester long. The ones that aren't core rotate off after 3 attempts. So you get 3 tries to get 2 successful attempts. Okay, it's pretty rigorous, if I'm allowed to use that word. And then finally, how this all comes together in a course grade. We still do give grades at GVSU like everybody else. And this is the way that all that stuff maps onto grades of A, B, C, D, and F, this table. It's basically a checklist. In fact, I have a checklist version of this that I give to my students, and they're going to be filling that out for midterms next week. Earning a C, for example, you would need to complete all of the items in the C row, 16 out of 25 class preps, about 2/3 of the class preps done. Level 2, 2 demonstrations of skill on all 8 of the core targets, and 1 demonstration of skill on any 2 others of your choice, and 2 out of 8 problem sets done successfully. Okay, and you can see as you go up in grades, it's everything that the previous row was plus a little bit more. So it feels like concentric circles kind of radiating outwards. Now, I want to just mention here to end this part off here, students are first a little curious and maybe a little wary about this system because it's a little different, especially the fact that you might have surmised that there's no partial credit involved in anything. I mean, partial credit is not even a concept that makes sense in this class because there's no numerical credit on anything. So there's no partial credit, and there's no way to sort of average out bad performance on one thing by getting better performance on some other thing. If you in a traditional class, if you blow it on a test, maybe you can just do extra well on the quizzes. And I don't think that's good practice because tests and quizzes are different, trying to measure different things, and so they're kind of apples and oranges in some ways. I really insist on consistent excellence across the board on everything if you want an A or a B in the class. So they're a little wary about this, but two things eventually win them over. Number one is the revision process. Okay, nothing in the class other than class prep is one and done. You can make mistakes, and as long as it's a good faith effort, you can come back and repair them. A bad day is not the end of the story, as it was for Alice from earlier in the talk, or for my calculus student from earlier in the talk. And the second thing is that the fact they realize this pretty quickly, that once you earn a particular grade in the course, you can't go down. Your grade never goes down in the system. It only goes up or stays where it is. So if you earn all the requirements for a C, the floor for you in the class is a C. You could walk away from the class right at that moment and still have a C. Some people debate whether that's a bug or a feature. I think it's a feature, but that's another debate we can have. And for me, I feel like I'm holding higher academic standards in this class than I ever have, because I don't have to put up with subpar work. If I feel like a student has done like the first 4 items on a problem set perfectly well, but there's one thing that's really bugging me about that 5th one, I'm not going to give them 80%. I'm just going to say, take this back and redo it. I feel like you can really get this right. I have faith that you are able to get this right, and I'm going to invite you to do it. If I feel that the student work doesn't meet standards for whatever reason, I'm just going to put retry on it along with my feedback and just put the ball back in the student's court. And this is okay because I'm not dooming anybody's future here. I'm just asking them to make a quick revision on something that takes maybe 10 minutes to do. So anyway, I hope you can see from this how the 4 pillars are working themselves out. And you might think about this too, that 4 pillars are actually like the physical embodiment in some ways of that feedback loop. By having clearly defined standards, students know what they're supposed to do. And so they are better able to do something. Okay, helpful feedback gives good information for students to act upon. The marks that indicate progress help them interpret what to do next. And the reattempts without penalty close and enable this whole loop here. And every system of implementing alternative grading, whether it's ungrading or specifications grading or standards-based grading or whatever grading, works like this. And that brings up the question, what now? What are you going to do now? Maybe you've listened to this for the last 40 minutes or so, and you're hyped to just kick traditional grading to the curb and just do something different. Or maybe you're skeptical, and that's okay. Or maybe you're curious, or some combination of curious and skeptical and hyped. Well, I'll say one thing first. If you're one of the latter two, some combination of skeptical and curious, I would just ask you to please read either David's and my blog or our book, or both. Okay, you might still be skeptical at the end. For all I know, you might be more skeptical at the end. I don't know. You got to make up your own mind on these things. But hopefully you'll learn some things. You'll see how people are doing things and making this work for themselves. And many of the questions you might have are addressed in there. But if you're thinking, yeah, I'm ready to go with this. This is a good idea and it's right for me, and I like to try this out, but you're not really sure what to do, I have 3 things to say to you. Okay, so hear me now, believe me later, possibly. First of all, keep it simple. This in our book is what David and I call the prime directive. Keep everything as simple as humanly possible in your class. Really, whether you're doing alternative grading or not. The tendency we academics have is to concoct these wildly complex systems to solve basically simple problems. And simplification is really hard work. We don't want to remove stuff. But if you don't do it, whatever system you end up with is going to be way too hard for students to grasp. It's going to be way too hard for you to grasp. And it's going to be too much work for everybody. For example, when I first launched my very first specifications grading system after that student experience that I had a class that had 63 learning objectives listed out. And each one of those 63 learning objectives required multiple levels of reassessment on different kinds of assessment. And I thought it was the most awesome thing ever at the time. And I quickly found out that was a terrible idea. It was way too complicated. And I didn't even see the light of day for an entire semester. So don't be like me, okay? Just simplify things, okay? Remember what Michelangelo said, that simplicity is the ultimate form of sophistication. Or maybe that was Da Vinci, I'm not sure. And also something that I think is true, that most problems that we have can be solved by removing something. The second thing I want to really encourage you and make sure you hear is that you don't have to do it all. In fact, trying to do everything all at once will kind of drive you a little crazy. For example, you don't have to convert your entire class over to ungrading, or all of your classes over to ungrading, for example, to reap the benefits of ungrading. You can weave in bits and pieces and philosophies of ungrading in partial ways, like, for example, ungrading a single assignment and just see how it goes. But some people in the alternative grading community are passionate, and that's great. But sometimes the passion gets to the point of like religious zealotry, and you'll hear things like, I do ungrading because I really care about my students. And I don't doubt that those people care about their students, but the implication is that if you don't go all in, if you are not totally sold out for ungrading, that you don't really care about students. That's not true, and it's not helpful, because a lot of y'all might be in situations where you just can't do it all. Like there's no way you could implement a specs grading system in a class, for example, for whatever reason. And I'll honor that reason. It's probably not just resistance or laziness or whatever. It's probably real. Okay, so the encouragement I would give to you is that you don't have to go all in. You can do little things. Okay, if you don't want to undergo a complete course redesign, you don't have to. In fact, I would. If you try to, you're just gonna make everybody unhappy. Okay, and that gets me to the third thing I want to say, and that is, the 4 pillars are a great model for doing partial things and getting small wins. Okay. If you're thinking about using alternative methods, but you're not sure if it would work in your situation because you have a huge class, because you have a coordinated lab section, you don't have the creative freedom to do what you want to do, or you're a contingent faculty member and you're a little worried about blowback. Okay, so I would encourage you to do this. Look at the 4 pillars, pick one pillar and do one thing. Okay, pick one of the 4 pillars and do one thing to move in a positive direction along that one axis. For example, maybe you can just write out your learning targets. What are your learning objectives for your lesson? And tell students what standard is being addressed on each problem in your next exam. Maybe you can work on your feedback. Maybe really strive to give feedback that's more helpful. If you can just do that, I mean, that's a major win. Maybe this semester or next semester, you can switch from points to labels that indicate progress. And if you must, you can take that label and convert it back into points if you need to. Maybe you might try giving some limited reattempts, like limited but without penalty on one or more of your assignments this semester. You don't have to do it all. And if all you can manage in your situation is positive motion on one thing along one pillar, that is good enough, folks. It's more than good enough. It's a massive win for you and for your students. And we got to be satisfied with small wins in this business, So that is the end of my talk. Before I kind of wrap it up here, let me just reiterate the main message here. Traditional grading, we've seen many different ways in which traditional grading is completely broken. And I think it's broken to the point you just can't fix this anymore. But it is replaceable, and we have every right and every opportunity to replace traditional grading with something better if we want to. It's a relatively new addition to higher education. It's not a centuries-old tradition. And I think now might be the time to start thinking about doing this, given all the challenges we face as professors and faculty and shared governance and all the other things that our students are dealing with as well. So I hope that you get something out of this. Before I kind of wrap it up finally, I want to just hit some questions here that were submitted to me before the talk. All the questions were great. These really rose to the top either because they were asked more than once or because I feel like they're very important. First of all, there were several questions along the lines of how do you make this work in blank, like in a large lecture class, in a humanities class, in a language class, in a music class, in a STEM class, in a coordinated lab section class, in an online asynchronous class. Rather than try to reiterate all this, I'm just going to point you to our book. Okay. Of course, I deeply appreciate your buying books, but even if you just borrow it from somebody, it's all good. This is our index of case studies in the book, and you can see it is coming from all over the place. We have large classes, small classes, face-to-face online classes, synchronous online classes, hybrid classes, STEM classes, humanities classes. And not shown here are size of institutions. Some of these are big, R1 institutions like Northwestern. Some of them are small liberal arts colleges, all done by real live faculty members who are making this work somehow. Okay, I'm at a loss to, if I were ever slotted into a 200-person history of art class like Gretchen Bender was, I think I would probably panic. But she's making this work really, really well, and you should read about this. So I would just really point you to, if you're looking for specific instances, check it out in the book, and also pay attention to the blog, because once a month we have guest posters blogging their process with us. Okay. Another question that was asked is, I thought I might have noticed this popping up in the Q&A too. How do you address pushback from people that think that initiatives like this water down the rigor of the program and will result in less well-prepared students? Good question, because you do get some pushback about this sometimes. It seems like we're being very permissive with students in this process of alternative grading. But in fact, it's actually, and I also have questions about the word rigor. Like, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean just like, sometimes rigor can be a synonym for toxic masculinity, to be perfectly honest. It can be just being a jerk. I'm going to be rigorous means I'm going to just try to crush you at every moment with my tests. If we take a more, at its best, it means like the course has an appropriate difficulty level. Okay, well, you can put the best construction possible on that. Well, in an alternative grading system, one of the highlights of any functioning system is that students are producing real evidence of learning. It's not sort of like approximated evidence that's mediated by a test. They're creating things. They're solving real problems, and they're giving concrete evidence of learning of clearly defined content standards. They're producing a portfolio that I can point back to and say, this student got an A because they put in all this work, and here it is. Here's the work. If I got their permission, I could even hand the portfolio over to somebody. It's not unrigorous if it's backed up. It's not grade inflation if it's backed up. Okay. And I would say, as the professor of an alternatively graded course, you get to decide what the standards are. You can probably, it might not be a bad idea to consult with students on that at some point and keep them in mind. Don't make standards wildly inaccessible, but you get to decide what an A means, and you don't have to, water it down at all if you don't feel like it. Okay. And as long as you're willing to give helpful feedback and allow reattempts without penalty, you can create high standards if you want to. And then if somebody gives you pushback, you can just point to the scoreboard and say, this student demonstrated skill twice on 14 out of 15 learning targets. Like that's way better than getting a 90 on a test. So the pushback that I get from people is to say, look at the evidence, look at the data, okay? Rather than looking at statistical data that was sort of corrupted by the fact that the points you're using aren't really numerical data to begin with, actually look at concrete evidence that students provide that directly connects them to their learning. That's what alternative grading allows you to do. Another question, I thought this was unique because I didn't know until just recently that y'all at Northwestern are on the quarter system. And this is an interesting question. How can you, basically on the quarter system, you have a shortened time scale. How do you deal with it? This is a really interesting question. I deal with this sometimes when I teach summer classes that are 6 weeks long. So it's really, really highly accelerated. You can still do alternatively graded courses. And I think that one of those case studies might have been a short scale 10-week class, possibly. I'd check me on that. I'm going to blog about that pretty soon, just my own experiences with this very question. But I would also say, you have to be a little mindful that you're on a short time scale. You got to be very clear with assessments. And it also helps to give students multiple ways to demonstrate mastery. Like right now in my discrete structures course, we have weekly quizzes. Weekly quizzes probably would not be sufficient in a 10-week or 12-week quarter system course. I would probably add some flexibility into that system by having weekly quizzes, but also allowing students to come to, say, oral exams in the office, or make a video of themselves working out a quiz question or something like that. or finding a system like an auto-graded computer system that would do some of this work for me, assessment work for me. Build in flexibility for students because they're going to need it in that narrow time frame, but it can still be done. And be mindful, though, of the workload that you place on students, because every time you give an assessment, it's work for students to do. And if you have reassessments on that, it's more work for students to do. So, you have to keep the scale in mind. But so flexibility is good, letting students choose, different ways of demonstrating the same kind of mastery. A couple more questions here, and then I'll be done. These are two questions that are kind of the same basic feel to them. Not everybody can get an A. How can you give fewer than all A's without demoralizing a student? How can you give a lower grade without demoralizing a student? And how do you allay the anxieties of students about grading? I mentioned before that two features of the specifications grading style that I use in discrete structures is everything can be redone. Nothing is the last word until the final buzzer of the course. And I think that gives students some hope here. Okay. Helpful feedback does a lot of good with counteracting demoralization. You can say, like, okay, so this wasn't quite up to our standards, and here's why. I'm going to invite you to do a reattempt on this, and here's what you should do. Okay, so it tells students that, yeah, you messed up. It's okay. We expect that. Okay, it would be weird if you didn't. And so we're going to set up a system where you can redo stuff without penalty if it doesn't meet our standards. And the other thing that students really latch themselves onto is the idea that their grade never goes down in the course. It just keeps going up or stays the same. And so that helps them feel like I'm actually climbing up a ladder here. I'm actually accomplishing something as I go through this interesting experience of a class. And then just being open, communicating with your students early and often about how they're doing. What is it like? What questions do you have? And just being very open about communicating with them about their experiences in the course. A lot of times you can head off student problems simply by communicating with your students. And it shouldn't be a revelation to us, but for a lot of faculty, it's just like, wow, communicate with your students. That's crazy talk. So crazy, it might just work. Okay. That's it for me, y'all. We're going to transition into an AMA time here, but I just want to say, first of all, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your work at Northwestern University, one of our premier universities in the United States. And I love the city of Chicago, and I kind of wish I could be over there with you right now. But if I would love to contact you, continue this on even after the AMA is over with. My email is there. You can reach me on Twitter or whatever it's called these days at that handle. I'm on LinkedIn as well. And my main website is rtalbert.org. Our blog is gradingforgrowth.com. There is the cover of our book with that cool minimalist sprout thing happening there. Love for you to read that book. We're very happy with the way it turned out. And then the QR code there is to the resource page, which has links to all of this stuff here. So again, thank you so much. I'm going to turn this back over to Jen or whoever is in charge next, and we'll take it from there. Thanks again.
Thank you, Robert, for such a thought-provoking keynote. I'm just going to get my notes pulled up here. I want to start by sharing a comment that was submitted in advance. So I just want to learn everything I can to be the best for my students. And I'm wondering if you're finding in your speaking tour, if that's a common sentiment.
That's a great sentiment to have, and I really am grateful for whoever it is made that comment because I hope that's true for all of us. Our students are really putting themselves out there to learn with us and from us, and we owe it to them to kind of just continuously improve upon this practice that we have. I find that wherever I go, it's very rare that I just find professors that are uninterested in growth, like their own or their students or any such thing. I do think it's more common than people realize. It's sometimes a little disincentivized to talk that way. I feel like that it's weird that it is, but I don't know. I find faculty everywhere are, first of all, very unhappy with the way that grading works right now. I get this really deep, unexpressed, hard to put words to it, dissatisfaction, like an existential dissatisfaction with the way grades have been done, much the way that I was dissatisfied after my student experience. It was like I had this cancerous growth on my teaching, and I never even realized it for 14 years. I got to get rid of this thing, and that's there's sort of an urgency in that sense. And so, learning about how to do this, yeah, you are not alone if you're in that position, and you're in exactly the right place, as a professional, if that's your field. I mean, we're professors, right? I mean, it's our job to learn things. That's what it's all about. And so, if we're not learning about our own professional practice, and what are we even doing? So, good on you for having that. And there's a lot of people like you out there.
Let's talk about something that's very timely right now and on a lot of people's minds around generative AI. So we've got some questions about how we can leverage the use of generative AI in assessments. And one participant added that they personally don't think that banning AI is productive. So what might be some possible benefits of incorporating it into our assessment practices?
Yeah, I'm right there with all of y'all on this. I'm just trying to kind of keep my head above water with what ChatGPT can do and can't do and all that. I would just like to say, I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school in the 90s in math, we had a period of our history, what's known as the math wars. Some of you may know what I'm talking about. It was a period of time where technology was beginning to really ramp up. Graphing calculators were becoming very affordable, handheld graphing calculators that would do symbolic calculations. And these same questions were coming up back then. Like, well, if I have a calculator that can factor a polynomial, then what am I supposed to be doing here for? And what am I here for? That's exactly it. What are we here for? And the answer back then that kind of got us up to now was we really can't focus on those kinds of skills. We can assess them if we want to, but we also have to keep in mind that we live in the real world and this technology exists, and banning it is just sort of a pointless task after a certain point. I mean, in isolation, maybe. Okay. For example, when I give my learning target assessments in discrete structures, they are in-class assessments because I want it to be kind of a controlled environment. These are real simple, but in when it's time to do more sophisticated problem solving, I'm saying anything goes. I mean, you can use whatever you want. I mean, I'm trying to be creative to create assessments that are as personalized as possible to the students. And I think, to me, that's the key thing to kind of keep AI on the good guy side, right? Where AI could be used as a tool for learning and not as a replacement for it. Like, for example, that little snippet I showed in the talk was you have to encrypt a certain message using a certain method. All you have to do to really kind of get past the AI, or try to get past the AI, is to have students make up their own message. And it turns out it's actually not easy to type that in correctly as a prompt into a ChatGPT. I tried it and I made sure that was pretty AI proof. Personalizing assessments whenever possible is a good idea, generally speaking, especially in the role of AI. Another thing you might do is, you can create assessments that ask students to really critically evaluate the results of AI. One of the things that's coming down the road for us in this particular class is a particular kind of problem where you have to count the number of complex arrangements of something, like the number of ways you can get a straight flush and a poker hand. It's like complicated counting problems. And I, just for fun, gave ChatGPT one such problem and Bard the same problem. I picked like 4 different AIs and gave them the same problem. I got 4 completely different answers, none of which were correct. And so this is an interesting opportunity to say, like, okay, I gave all these AIs this problem. They have these 4 different answers. Which one, if any of them, is correct and why? Okay, so an AI, not yet anyway. I mean, maybe in 10 years, who knows? In which case I'll be retired in 10 years, so I don't have to deal with it. But an AI at this point cannot distinguish between the flawed outputs of other AIs that I know of. I could be wrong about that, but that's actually a very high level Bloom's taxonomy kind of evaluation task that I think is really appropriate for classes at the university level. So the further up you go, Bloom's taxonomy too, the easier it is to keep AI as a tool, not as a crutch.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for those ideas. You just mentioned personalized assessments, and earlier you talked about the opportunities for regrading, which sound great for students, but what about faculty workload? So we had a question in the chat that was asking about pushback. So I think you really effectively address pushback around rigor. But what about a department colleagues feeling like they don't have time to regrade?
Well, it's understandable. It sounds like a ton of work. And I would say it certainly was for me when I wasn't simplifying everything. First of all, remember, keep everything as simple as humanly possible. One way to what I had to learn for myself, I'll just share this. What I had to learn for myself, I'm to a point where my grading, I mean, it's not any worse than it's ever been. I mean, it's not especially more grading than traditional grading courses. It's different in quality, but not necessarily in quantity, if that makes sense. I find that with I teach two classes, 30 students each, so take it with a grain of salt. But if I grade for an hour a day, it's enough. Okay, so the way I tend to make that work, and it's on a small scale. I know if you're teaching 200 students, this may not apply to you. I would say go read our book and see what they do. But on a scale like that, what I found to be useful is, first of all, don't assign so much stuff in the first place. So that was my big problem. Is I was, every time you give an assessment, you are committing to multiple, hours and hours and hours of work grading and regrading that assessment. Really, when you're building the course before the semester starts, really be honest with yourself about whether it's worth it. Like every assessment you give can give you useful information about student learning, but that doesn't mean you have to give every single assessment you can think of. Some assessments might not really be worth the effort it takes to grade them. Like you get some information about student learning, but it's a tremendous amount of effort. If I find that in one of my course syllabi, I cut it. I just cut it and don't look back. I would rather have fewer assessments and less information than so much information that I can't process it in a grading session. So cut it off at the source whenever possible. And secondly, remember that feedback doesn't have to be extensive to be good. The research that we've seen that David and I studied about effective feedback, sometimes it's like one sentence of something that went really well, one sentence of something that needs fixed. And that's it. That's enough. And anything more than that is just sort of redundant. And sometimes maybe students don't read our feedback because we're giving so much of it. It seems like it's just information overload. But if you keep the signal to noise ratio down and really target the feedback, then it's less of it. It's less work to give it. Sometimes it's the same feedback being given over and over again, in which case I have text snippets set up for that. If there's certain things like sometimes I'll give a problem set and I know like half the students are going to make the same mistake over and over again. Well, I'm not going to type that out over and over again. I'm going to fire up my text expander program and program a little snippet for it and do a shortcut, and it just pops it right in. It's the advantage of doing things electronically. So that's sort of a life hack, I guess. You can also find some places.
I was going to say, there's quite a few questions that I think are seeking your life hacks. So one in the chat related to, providing this verbal feedback that lets students know exactly where they went wrong. So I think what I hear you saying is that you have some kind of standardized responses that you're able to do a kind of customized copy and paste so that the feedback is providing a lot of useful information about target areas for improvement.
Yeah, I think we all do this when we grade. We're grading student work, and we tend to notice that things cluster together. Okay, the student issues tend to kind of crop. Not always. I mean, every student kind of makes mistakes in their own way, but there are often times when there's a category of mistake, and you can globally describe it and then give some specific feedback. Anything that is typed out more than once becomes a text snippet for me, because I just refuse to type anything twice. I'm just extremely lazy in that way. One of the things that I think everybody ought to realize is I want to work as little as possible. That's my whole goal in life. I have music to play, I have other things to do besides grading. And so my goal is to make my grading, informative and growth oriented and useful, but also limited. Okay. One thing that I would also to really make sure that everybody hears this is when I say reattempts without penalty, that doesn't mean reattempts without limits. Okay. So, for example, it is totally okay to put reasonable boundaries around reattempts in your class. Okay. You don't want to penalize students for reattempts, but if you only want students to submit 2 resubmissions a week total of anything, that's okay. Or if you want to give an assessment that says you can resubmit this as often as you want, but only in 7 days' time, or something like that, where it puts a limit, it puts a boundary around student reattempts, that is okay as long as it's a reasonable boundary. For my checkpoints with the small scale learning targets, those are on weekly quizzes. Okay. And anything that's not a core target rotates off after 3 attempts. So you got 3 chances to get this right. Otherwise, you got to wait till November to try it again. For the problem sets, students are allowed to submit 2 problem sets a week. That's 2 new ones or 2 reattempts, or 1 new one and 1 reattempt. And that's it. When it gets to the end of the semester, you don't get to do 3, it's 2. So it keeps it at a steady drip, and that makes it predictable. I'm never going to have more than about 50. So I'm never going to have more than 100 of those things to grade in a week. And that would be a really bad week if it had 100 of them to grade, but it would never be more than that. It's never been that much. It's never been even close to that much. So, because students get it. I mean, students get it that there are limitations, and they agree with those limitations. I mean, it's only sensible. And so they tend to, my statement to them is like, just do it in consistent small steps throughout the semester, and it's no problem. If you try to stick it at the end of the semester and do it all at once, it's not going to work.
My colleague is letting us know that we have about 3 minutes left, and Robert's been extremely generous in providing additional video responses to questions. So we'll make sure he receives everything that we haven't covered yet. Along the tips and techniques line of inquiry, what about grading class participation? We want to find ways to incentivize students coming to class, having done the readings. We want them to contribute to class discussion. But how do we make that more than just a showing up for attendance grade?
Sure, yeah. First of all, I do want to mention that I took several of these questions offline. I have a video linked to the resource page. It's like 35 minutes long. That's got some of these questions answered. This is one of them, but I think it's worthwhile I'll answer it again and see if it agrees with the answer that's in the video. How about that? So attendance, first of all, you might choose not to grade attendance. Okay. It's not a given that you must grade attendance. And just because you grade attendance doesn't mean that you guarantee good attendance. I would say be really clear with yourself. What is it that you're trying to assess when you grade attendance or participation? It's all just part of that clear standards pillar. Like, what constitutes good participation? Do you want people just to show up? Do you want people to what is it you're wanting people to do, and what is it that you're trying to assess here? Some people would say that you shouldn't do participation or attendance because it's not equitable. Like, different people, might have different standards, cultural standards, or life situations that would mitigate against what we normally think of as participation or attendance. So I don't know. You got to really be really clear about that with yourself and your students, first of all. And you might decide, I don't think I'm going to do this anymore. But if you do, you want to make it so that that students also know what it is they're supposed to be doing. Okay, if you want to have a substantive, I'm going to mark you as having participated if you have a substantive comment in today's class discussion. Well, okay, what is a substantive comment, and what if I just can't get to it? I mean, can I demonstrate my learning in some other way? What you're trying to do there is promote substantive discussions. So that's what you're trying to do. And again, ask yourself, does grading it actually promote it, or does it make it sort of superficial, possibly? Sometimes it does. This is a situation, I think, too, where a little flavor of ungrading might actually go quite a ways. Like, maybe you can just lay out what the standards are, and you can say, ask students to grade themselves on this, and just say, okay, at the end of the class, take a little Google form survey as an exit ticket. And do you feel like you participated substantively today? Did you meet our participation standards today? If so, tell me what you did. If not, tell me why not and what you might need to be better next time. Each place where you're kind of telling students what they did, sticking a mark on it maybe that or not, that indicates their progress, and inviting them to do better.
Thank you for those ideas. I think that helps us all be more intentional in our practices. As a teaser for next week's core session 1 is a panel, a conversation with more real world examples, scenarios, and experiences with what is challenging and even controversial about alternative grading. And we will again follow up with a survey for feedback on Robert's talk. We hope that you'll recommend it to your colleagues. We have the recording available, as well as the additional resources that Robert has shared with us. We'll make those available on the Searle Center website. So thank you so much, Robert, for your generosity of time and these engaging ideas today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.